Delighted that you're here, and I hope you've got your Bible with you and are eager to take that and study with us as we talk about some things practical for our daily living. Let me ask you a question. Do you ever get mad? Do you ever have something that's said or done to you where you react and your reaction is you get mad about that? Would you describe your reaction as getting angry? Do you ever get angry? Would you say, yes, sometimes I do get angry? Well, the question is, how do you deal with that? How do you respond to that anger? How do you channel that anger? What do you do with that? The truth of the matter is, we all get mad and we all get angry at some point. Even God got angry. In the book of Exodus, chapter 4 and in verse 14, the text says that the Lord got angry. The text says that so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. This is when Moses was telling the Lord he couldn't do what God had asked him to do. I'm not the man for that. I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue. And the anger of the Lord was aroused against Moses. I can understand God's anger against the corrupt world of Genesis 6. But he's angry with Moses. 30 times scattered throughout the Bible, we read expressions of the Lord getting angry and his anger being stirred. And so our God is a God of anger. In Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 26, you are familiar with that. If not, we need to be familiar. The text says, "Be angry and do not sin." So that text tells me there is a possibility I can have anger and yet not sin with that anger, and that there are times that I can have anger and I can sin. The reason for that is that there are varied reactions to anger. By varied reactions, we suggest sometimes people in anger blow up in a heartbeat. Maybe they have a short fuse. And all you have to do is say something wrong, do something wrong, and that person just explodes. They blow up in anger. The other side of that coin is that some then simply brew and they stew and they sulk and they become distant. They don't blow up, but they're reacting in anger. Something was said, something was done, something offended them. One person blows up and another person just kind of goes off in their shell and they just sulk for that. I want to suggest to you that the Bible gives a better answer to anger than either one of those, than drawing back and sulling and in bursting forth in some kind of explosion. So let's talk about the Christian's battle with anger, how to manage our anger from the biblical point of view. What does the Bible have to say about that? 3 things we want to notice this morning. Let's start with the root of the problem of anger is the way we think. I want to suggest to you that an anger problem is a thinking problem. So if you're one that says, you know what, I like everybody, I get angry, but I really have a problem with anger. You say, I'd just like to know where my problem is. Your problem most likely is in your thinking. Because at the root of the problem, the anger problem is a thinking problem. Someone has correctly said, sow an act and you reap a habit. You sow a habit, you reap a character. Sow a character and you reap a destiny. I like that. You sow an act, you reap a habit. You do something and it becomes habit. And then that habit becomes your character. And that character then forms your destiny. Your eternal destiny even. But I want to back up before that and suggest to you that you sow a thought and you reap an act. And then you sow an act and you reap a habit. In other words, the act starts not with the act, but it starts with our thinking process. Part of the thinking process is that we cannot help what our anger is and what our anger does. And you hear people say things, you know what, I just can't help it. I get angry and I can't help that. Or they may say, you know, that's just the way that I am. I'm just given and I'm driven that. It's in the family. It's part of the family genes. I'm given to anger and my family was given to anger. That's just the way that I am. And someone will say, well, I'm just different from everybody else. I just react different than you do. There's nothing wrong with what I do. So let's focus on the root is the way that we think. Let's establish several points. Here's the first. Let's establish the fact that thinking controls our actions. Let's get a biblical point of view of this. Let's go to Matthew chapter 15. And I want us to see that thinking controls our actions. That no one ever acts, whether it be murder or adultery or fornication or even doing righteousness, until first of all they thought in that direction. That's all we're trying to establish. Thinking controls our action. Look at verse 18 and 19 of Matthew chapter 15. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. Now here's verse 19. For out of the heart, that is the mind of man, his thinking. For out of the thinking of man proceeds the evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornication, thefts, and false witness. You see, all of these sins, these overt actions come forth from his thinking process. That's all we're trying to see at this juncture. Let's go to a couple of passages in Proverbs. You are familiar with this. Proverbs 4 and verse 23. Keep your heart, that's your mind, your thinking with all diligence. Be careful what you think, in other words. Be careful what you dwell on. Be careful what you focus upon. Be careful what you take in and turn over and mull in your mind, for out of it are the issues of life. That is, this is how you live. You function and you act based on your thinking. Well, the other passage in Proverbs 23 and verse 7, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. That's the real man. So whatever you're thinking, that you may be acting in one way or trying to act or put on a front, but what's going on in your mind is your real character. So be careful what you think. Let's go to a New Testament passage, this time in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We've developed this recently in a class. We developed it also recently in a sermon, so I won't spend a great deal of time here. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, the argument is to abstain from sexual immorality. All right, that's an overt act of sin. How do I do that? How do I do that? Well, let's look at 1 Thessalonians 4 and notice at verse 4. He said that each one of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. You abstain from sexual immorality, verse 3, by controlling your body, verse 4. Okay, how do I do that, Paul? All right, you know where we're going. Look at verse 5. Not in passions of lust. Control your thinking. So when you control your thinking, you control your body. And when you control your body, you control the sin. All we're trying to establish is our thinking controls our actions. Here's another point we want to develop. Still focusing on the root of the problem is our thinking. We can control our thinking. Do you ever hear anyone say, you know what, I may can control what I do, but I can't help what I think? You may not control what comes into your mind, but you can control what stays in your mind. And the Bible so affirms that for us. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 5. Paul talks about our warfare that we're battling, the battle that we fight. Casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. In other words, we're in a battle against things that are against God. Now notice what else he says. Look at verse 5. Bringing every thought into captivity in obedience of Christ. Even our thinking is to be brought in subjection under the rule of Christ. So that means I can take some things and push them out of my mind. I can focus on what I need to, and I cannot focus on things I don't need to. I can control my thinking. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. This is a very familiar text. Perhaps you haven't thought of this verse in this light. We often appeal to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, showing the sinfulness of man. We also appeal to this passage showing sinful men can change. But I want you to notice, if the overt action is wrong, which he mentions a number of overt actions like fornication, homosexuality, sodomy, thieves, and covetous, and drunkards, etc. If we can control that, and we can, because he said, and such were some of you, that is, you gave it up and you quit it, then you can control your thinking, because that comes from thinking. But that's not my point. Alone. Look at verse 9. Not only is there fornication and adultery, but notice in verse 10 he says thieves and covetous. Covetous is a thinking problem. You were covetous and you're no longer covetous. They controlled their thinking. They had to control their thinking. Now, so we can control our thinking, but let's go even further and carry that a step further, that we must control our thinking. We have to do that. Not only can I, but I have to do that. Look at Matthew chapter 12 with me. Matthew chapter 12. Jesus warns, beginning at verse 33, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or else the tree bad and its fruit bad. A tree is known by its fruit. Drop down now to verse 35. For a good man out of the good treasure his heart brings forth good things. If you want good to come out in your life, you're going to have to think good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. That is, evil comes from evil minds. So I have to control my thinking. Back to Matthew 15. I'm not going to read that for you because we just read that. But that was the verse that said, out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, etc. So if I'm thinking about things that lead to adultery, or I'm thinking about things that lead to stealing, I'm going to have to control and must control my thinking. Here's the fourth principle. And that is, I can control my anger. My thinking has to be controlled. But if I can control my thinking, then I can control my anger. I may not control the circumstance that prompts that anger. More about that in a moment. But I can control my anger. So let's go to some Old Testament passages this time. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 14 and go to verse 29. Proverbs 14 and verse 29. I just want you to see, we're going to notice a number of Proverbs. This is going to lace well with the lessons we just had from Wes Brown as he talked about wisdom literature and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and those kind, Job, those books that have to do with practical daily living. Well, here's part of that practical daily living. Here are some passages that tell me that I can control my anger. Proverbs 14 and 29. He that is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he that is impulsive exalts folly. The person that blows up is foolish. They're showing, you know what, I'm foolish in my behavior. But, he said, the one that's slow to wrath has understanding. So I can control my thinking. Let's go over a couple of chapters. Same book, book of Proverbs, chapter 16, and notice verse 32. Proverbs 16 and in verse 32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than one who takes the city. You think of military action, one who is mighty and powerful. They can storm and take a city. They can control a nation. You think how powerful that is. The proverb writer is saying if you can rein in your spirit, you can rein in your anger, you can control your anger, you're stronger than mighty warriors. Let's go to another passage in the book of Proverbs. Let's go to the 19th division. Let's go to Proverbs 19 and look at verse 11. Proverbs 19 and verse 11. We're just seeing we can control our anger. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger. In other words, the wisdom of man. The man who is wise and listens to God and listens to his instruction is slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. Doesn't mean he ignores sin, but he doesn't necessarily react constantly to every wrong that's done toward him. So what have we seen so far? What we've tried to establish is that the root of the problem is the way that we think. So what have I learned? I've learned that thinking controls my action. I can control my thinking. I must control my thinking. And I can control anger. I can control that. The Bible tells me so. So I know what the root is. Let's talk about the problem now. By the problem I'm talking about, sometimes in our battle with anger, we end up attacking the person rather than attacking the problem. Let's talk about what that involves. Let's talk about attacking the person. Let's talk about the anger itself. Anger itself is not wrong within itself. So someone comes along and says, you have anger sometimes and you sin because you have anger. That's not necessarily wrong. The Lord was angry. We've already talked about that. Exodus chapter 4 and verse 14. You are familiar with this text because we've quoted it earlier. Be angry and do not sin. So it's possible I could be angry and that doesn't lead to sin. There are times I need to be angry. That is a God-given emotion that I can channel and I can hone it in the right direction and use it properly. Maybe I need to be angry about some things. Anger itself is not the problem. So I know a little bit about anger. Let's just take anger and stick it off to the side for a moment. We're going to come back and make use of that in a moment. Now let's talk about the occasion or the situation that may stir that anger. What is it that stirs anger in our hearts? Well, maybe it's the fact that you've been done wrong. Quite often that's the case. Maybe you feel like you've been slighted. Every one of us have fit in that category at some point where somebody we think slighted us. We think someone did us wrong. Our feelings sometimes are hurt. Somebody said something that hurt our feelings. It may have been family, it may have been a coworker, it may be a neighbor, it may have been brethren. Maybe we feel like we've been overlooked. We feel like that others overlooked us and that they were singling out others for their accomplishments, and I was overlooked. I wasn't included. My feelings are hurt. Maybe I feel like that someone takes advantage of me. I feel like I'm being used, and that makes me angry. Or maybe you feel like you've been treated different than other people. There's a set of rules for others, and they have a set of rules for you, and that's not fair. And you've been treated unfairly. Or maybe someone does something that you think, and this is a biblical word, that you think is absolutely stupid. And it's directed toward you. And you don't know what to do about that. Now let's pause for a moment, and I'm not going to trace every one of these passages. I just want to make a running list for emphasis that many people have been wronged. So you're not the only one. You're not the first one. I'm not the first one. What do we mean by that? Well, Abraham was wronged by Lot, wasn't he? Do you remember in Genesis chapter 13 where Abraham gave him the choice and Lot chose the better fields, the better land? He had been done wrong. That is, Abraham had been done wrong by Lot. Not only Abraham, but Jacob was wronged by Laban. You remember Laban made an agreement, you work with me for 7 years and I'll give you Rachel. 7 years he gave him Leah. Now you need to work another 7 years before you can have Rachel. He was done wrong. And he thought he was done wrong. Joseph was obviously wronged by his brothers. They sold him. We're going to say more about him in a moment in Genesis 50. But the story starts in Genesis 37. He was done wrong. David was wronged by his son Absalom, who rebelled against him and tried to become king in his place and would have had his father killed. David was wronged. Paul was wronged by John Mark. You remember John Mark went along on the trip and then turned back. And Paul lost all confidence for a while in him. He felt like he'd been done wrong. He turned his back on me and the work. Jesus was done wrong by Judas, who betrayed him, and he was done wrong by Peter, who denied him. Promised he'd even die for him, and then that very night turned his back on him. All I'm trying to suggest is that many people have been done wrong. So I know there's a place for anger. I've got that. We're talking about attacking the person, the problem here. I know there's a place for anger. And I've talked about the circumstance and the occasion that may drive that. But let's talk about our reaction to that. There's two reactions I want to talk about. The first is where we just blow up in reaction to that. Let's see if we can find some passages that deal with that concept. Some of these may repeat principles we've already noted. But let's go now back to Proverbs, the 14th division, and look at verse 19. See, this doesn't describe, at least in part, this idea of reacting in anger where we just blow up because we didn't like what was said or done. I feel like I've been treated unjustly. Look at verse 29. He that is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly. Now, we already read that passage, but I want you to get this picture. There's the concept of being slow to wrath. You don't have a short fuse. In fact, you got a long fuse. Slow to wrath. Doesn't mean you don't ever have wrath, but you're slow to wrath. In contrast, look at verse 29. But the one who is impulsive, that is short of spirit, literally the footnote says. The one with the short fuse is foolish. Here's the idea of blowing up. That's one of the reactions. Let's go to another passage now. Let's go to the 21st division of Proverbs. And look at verse 19, Proverbs 21 and 19. It's better, there are about 4 passages that deal with this same concept throughout Proverbs. Not all of them make the same point. But it's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and an angry woman. Several passages mention her being contentious, but this one adds the word angry. In other words, it's very uncomfortable and very unpleasant to dwell in the house with this angry woman. And she's contentious, which suggests to me that she's not just sulling over here, but that she has outbursts at times. like we saw also in Proverbs chapter 14. Let's go to another Proverbs. Seeing what the Proverbs have to say about anger, numerous passages deal with anger. Proverbs 29 and in verse 22. An angry man stirs up strife. I think he's probably talking about an angry man who has the outburst, he blows up. It's not likely that his sulling over here and withdrawing in silence is going to stir up as much strife. But notice again verse 22, an angry man stirs up strife, and a furious man abounds in transgressions. You're more apt to do something wrong when you're filled with anger. But he stirs up strife. Let's go again to another Proverbs. Let's go to Proverbs 30 and notice in verse 33, the end of that section. For as the churning of milk produces butter and the wringing of the nose produces blood, so the forcing of wrath produces strife. Just as sure as you could wring someone's nose, it's going to produce blood, and you churn milk, it's going to produce butter. You force wrath. Here's this outburst of wrath again. You blow up. There's going to be some strife, and there's going to be some problem. Let's go to the book of Ecclesiastes now. One last passage there. Let's go to Ecclesiastes 7 and notice at verse 9. And here again is this reaction of reacting in anger. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Anger rests in the bosom of fools. This seems to be driven from the pride mentioned at verse 8, that pride causes this outburst of this wrath in verse 9. We'll say more about that perhaps in another study. But what I want to picture for you is, here's the reaction. We have anger, not wrong within itself. We know the occasion that may create that anger. But how do we react in that? Well, some people blow up like these passages say, and others clam up. Well, let's see if we can kind of diagram what goes on. Perhaps this describes you. Perhaps this describes me at times. Where here is an occasion, here's a problem, a situation, or an occasion for the anger, and we react in anger. It makes us angry. How do I react to that? Some people react by blowing up. And by blowing up, they burst forth with harsh words toward that person that they feel has done them wrong. There may be angry outbursts at them. There may be yelling, there may be screaming. In some cases, there may be a physical attack. More likely, they attack the person verbally. That may be more harmful in some sense than a physical attack. They treat them disrespectfully, but they blow up in anger. Someone else said, I don't act that way. I don't have that problem with anger. What I do is I have resentment and bitterness, and I get depressed, and I hold grudges, and I just clam up. That's my reaction to being done wrong. Anger drives them to clamming up. Quite often that brews to the point that leads to this outburst that we read about, and that's one of the reasons the Proverbs rather talks so much about that. What I want to suggest to you, and we're going to go to that in just a moment, that the solution is to attack the problem and not the person, rather than blow up in anger. Rather than clam up in bitterness, the Bible gives us a picture of addressing the problem. However, I've been done wrong. And let's talk about the result now. We're trying to describe the problem. When I blow up in anger or clam up and then it finally brews to blowing up, what problem does that create? It creates more problems and more friction. Let's go to the Psalms. Now, we've been in Proverbs. Let's go to another passage. This time, let's go to Psalms 37. And look at verses 1 to 9. And we won't read every verse of this. But this has to do with God's justice in dealing with our problems that we have. Notice he starts at verse 1. Do not fret because of evildoers. Do not be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they'll soon be cut off like the grass and wither like the green herb. You think someone's doing you wrong? Don't fret about that, the psalmist would say. David had many people who had done him wrong. They're soon going to be cut off. If they're continuing to do you wrong and they're sinning in so doing, and it's unjustified how they treat you, they're going to be cut off. Notice at verse 3, trust the Lord and do good. You react in goodness. We'll see some examples of that here in just a moment. Look at verse 5. Commit your way to the Lord. Look at verse 7. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Don't fret about someone doing you wrong, David said, or the psalmist said. But put your trust in God that God's going to take care of that. In other words, it creates more problems than it solves. Let's go to the Proverbs again. This time let's go to the book of Proverbs chapter 12 and look at verse 16. 12 and verse 16. I'm just trying to demonstrate from a number of the Proverbs again that it creates more problems and more friction when we blow up. Look at verse 16. A fool's wrath is known at once, but a prudent man covers shame. A prudent man may hide things. I don't mean that he's being a hypocrite, but he may hide that, and he doesn't let it be known. But a fool is going to let his anger known quickly. He's going to burst forth. It does more damage than good. Look at chapter 14, same book, book of Proverbs. Go to the 14th division and look at verse 17. A quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. Quick-tempered, short fuse, he's going to act foolishly. His thoughts are foolish, his actions will be foolish. It creates more problems than it solves. Let's go again to the book of Proverbs. This time to the 19th division and look at verse 19. Proverbs 19 and in verse 19. A man of great wrath will suffer punishment, for if you rescue him, yet he will do it again. In other words, he doesn't learn. So here's a man of wrath. He goes into problems and you rescue him from the problem, and he's going to go right back to the problem because that's how he's driven if he's following after blowing up every time because something didn't go his or her way. Let's go to another passage, two more passages. Proverbs 22. And notice at verse 24 and 25. Again, we're developing this concept and just trying to show multiple passages that deal with the concept of anger. Get the flavor of the Proverbs. Proverbs 22, verse 24. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go. In other words, don't spend a lot of time around people that blow up all the time and display their anger all the time. And they're stewing all the time, and they have a short fuse. Why? Look at verse 25. Lest you learn his ways, and he set a snare for you, so you'll become just like him. You'll think that's the thing to do. Well, let's go to one more along that line, and then we'll move to our third point. Let's go to Proverbs, the 27th division, and look at verse 3. Proverbs 27 and verse 3. A stone is heavy and the sand is weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. And here's the idea of how just as sand and stone is heavy, so the fool's wrath is heavy. It has great consequence. Brings great destruction, and it creates more problems than it solves. Here's the third thing we want to notice. We see the root of the problem. It's how we think. The problem is we attack the person. The answer is we need to address the problem. We need to address whatever the problem may be. So let's list a number of things here. Let's start with this. In addressing the problem of anger, look at your own wrongdoing. How so? Regardless of how much worse you've been treated by someone, you may have done wrong yourself. And if you've been wronged, that's better than doing wrong, isn't it? You say, I've had someone do me wrong. They said something to me that hurt my feelings. They slighted me. They did me wrong. Well, that's far better than you doing wrong. Matthew Henry once said, that's the great commentator, when he was robbed, he said, I'm thankful that they robbed me and I didn't rob them. It's a good attitude, isn't it? So when someone leaves you out, just say, I'm glad I wasn't the one that left them out. They said something that hurt my feelings. I'm glad it wasn't me that's hurt their feelings. And they overlooked me. Well, I'm glad I was not the one that overlooked them. That was Matthew Henry's attitude. We need to treat others right, not because we think they are right, but because we want to be right. So if you've been wrong, look and see what you've done. And I might need to raise this question. It could be that I have done some wrong myself. Notice in Colossians 3:21, Ephesians 6:4, same principle, same phrasing basically. And what I'm learning from that passage is it's possible to prompt a circumstance that breeds anger. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. In other words, fathers, behave yourself in such a way in handling your children that you don't promote anger from the child. Now, that's a whole study within itself. How could the father do that? I'm not interested in that. All I'm interested in at this juncture is the father's behavior can be such that it prompted the wrath and the anger from the child. It might be that I did something that prompted this anger that was driven from the other person that made them do something that makes me angry now. If I've done something wrong, I need to admit that and I need to correct that. Let's go again to the Proverbs along that kind of line. Let's go to Proverbs, the 28th division, and notice in verse 13. Proverbs 28 verse 13. He who covers his sin will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. In other words, I need to look at myself during that circumstance where I'm angry. Did I do something wrong to cause this problem? And if so, I need to admit it and I need to correct it. That's what James 5 in verse 16 is about. Here's the second thing. I need to make room for God's wrath. Let's go to Genesis chapter 50. What do we mean make room for God's wrath? Do you remember the case we talked about earlier where Joseph's brothers did him wrong? They sold him, would have killed him. And they sold him. And notice Genesis 50 and verse 19 that Joseph said when they were afraid standing before him, like, what are you going to do to us? He said this at verse 19, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Who do you think I am? I'm not God. I don't stand in the place of God. I'm not going to execute vengeance. That's not my place. And that was the point in Romans 12 and verse 19. Give place to wrath. What does that mean, give place to wrath? Give place to God's wrath. Don't stand in God's place of executing judgment. Don't try to get even. Don't try to settle the score, because that's God's place to do that. God's going to settle the score in time. It's not my place to do that. So give room for God's wrath. Don't let your anger get in the place of God's anger. If this person deserves wrath, God's going to take care of that. And that's what Joseph was saying. Here's the third thing. See God in the trial. In other words, when I've been done wrong, how can God fit in that trial? Well, let's go back to Genesis 50 and look at verse 20. Verse 19, he said, am I in the place of God? I'm not going to take the place of God. I'm not going to do that. Verse 20, but as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. He said God used this. Now, I don't think God's behind that. I don't think that's what he's saying. He's not saying God's behind what you did. God caused you to do that. God caused you to sell me. But you did evil and you were thinking evil. And that was your motive. But God's going to use this for my good. It's for my benefit that God let this happen. Well, Romans 8 said all things work together for the good of those that love God. And God can use things for our good. James 1 said, if any lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And what is that talking about in the context? Well, he had just said, notice in James chapter 1, you might turn there and get the picture, that James had just made the point that trials are for our good. Count it all pleasure, he said. Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Trials are going to be for your benefit. Trials will produce good. Trials will make you stronger. But in the midst of that trial and that circumstance, you can't see that. So ask God to give you the wisdom to look beyond and see the benefit of that. And that's what Joseph was saying. See God in the trial. Next, return good for evil. You've been done wrong. Rather than blowing up in reaction, return good for evil. Let's go back to Genesis 50. You notice the three thoughts, verse 19, verse 20, now verse 21. Joseph said he wasn't going to give place to God's wrath. I'm going to give place to God's wrath. I'm not going to take that. He secondly said that I see good in this. And then thirdly, he said, I'm going to give you good. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and for your little ones. I'm going to be good to you. You weren't good to me. But I see God in this. And I see benefit in how I was treated. I learned something from that. I grew from that. And I'm going to be good to you. Isn't that what Romans 12:21 said? Be not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Here's a fifth thing. Communicate to solve the problem. Somebody has done something that makes you angry. Communicate to solve the problem. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. We've been talking about this all morning. Be angry and do not sin. Remember that? Let's go back to that context. And I want to suggest that context tells me that you act promptly. Because the longer you delay settling this issue or dealing with the problem, perhaps your wrath begins to brew and to boil to the point that you again blow up in anger. Look at verse 26. Be angry, do not sin. And notice at verse 26 he said, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. Deal with it. You act promptly. You speak kindly. Go back to Proverbs. If you've left Proverbs, go back to Proverbs 15 and notice at verse 1. Proverbs 15 in verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stirs up anger. Someone's done you wrong and you burst forth in anger, that's going to cause them to react maybe in anger. But a soft answer, speaking kindly, allays wrath, turns it away. Talk. Don't clam up. Listen with the intent of understanding. Notice in Proverbs 15, look down at verse 18. You may still be there in Proverbs 18. A wrathful man stirs up strife, but he that is slow to anger allays contention. If you're slow to anger and you don't react harshly, then that kind of lays the contention aside and just calms the circumstance. Here's something else. Be active in solving your part of the problem. That's the point of Romans 12 and verse 18. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. As much as depends on you. Do your part. Be active, not passive. What do I mean? Be active in solving the problem rather than waiting on them to solve the problem with you. I didn't do any wrong. They're the one that did me wrong. I'm going to let them solve the problem. I've got nothing to do. Don't be passive. Put your energy into the problem rather than into fighting the person solving whatever that problem may be. And then understand this finally, that you don't have to let anger control you. Now, let's take a moment to look at a few passages that will help us with that. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 20. I'm just going to set the context for some of these and you'll understand the context. There's wrath mentioned in Galatians chapter 5 in the works of the flesh. Well, if it's a work of the flesh that I'm to put aside and have nothing to do with, then that means that I don't have to let anger control me. I can control the anger. That's all I'm learning from that, or I need to learn for this point. Well, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31. Take a look at Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 31. And the text tells me there that let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speak be put away from among you. In other words, I can take all that and I can put it away. Anger does not have to control me. Well, let's see the same principle in James chapter 1, Colossians 3. But James chapter 1 said, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. I don't have to let anger control me. One last passage in the lesson will be yours. Let's go to Proverbs one more time. Let's go to Proverbs 29 and look at verse 8. Proverbs 29 and verse 8. Scoffers set a city aflame, but wise men turn away wrath. Anger does not have to control me. So how do I address the problem? Look and see if I've done any wrong in this. Secondly, give place and let God take care of the executing wrath. See good in the trial. See God in the trial. Look for how I can treat them good. Communicate and solve the problem. Be active in solving your part. Understand you don't have to let anger control you. So what have we seen? The root of the problem is how we think. The problem is when we attack the person. The answer is we need to address the problem and not the person. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand while we sing?